Comrades, welcome to the founding conference of the Revolutionary Communist International. This is a truly historic occasion. It is a milestone in the development of our international. We are proud to stand on the great traditions of the Communist International. We trace our roots far back to the founding days of our movement, when Marx and Engels wrote the great Communist Manifesto. Today we are retying the knot of history, broken by Stalinism, at a time when the world revolution is beginning to develop, and our task is to resolve the crisis facing humanity, the crisis of revolutionary leadership, as the prerequisite for the victory of the world socialist revolution. We regard ourselves not as individual sections of this international. We regard ourselves as an integral part of the world party of socialist revolution. There's never been a better time as now to found this international, or refound this international, at a time when the lefts, the so-called socialists of the world, have adapted themselves to capitalism. There's never a better time to raise the genuine banner of communism internationally. And that is the reason why a whole series of our sections have renamed themselves Revolutionary Communists. And at the end of this week, at the end of our deliberations, we will take a vote to establish the Revolutionary Communist International. And we will broadcast this to the world. I would like to welcome, of course, all those comrades around the world in watch parties who are following our proceedings at this time. Online, I believe there are 120 countries of comrades and sympathizers following us at this stage. We send you our revolutionary greetings, comrades. And I would also particularly like to welcome our own gathering here today, and the different sections that are present from, I think, most of the continents of the world. But I would like to particularly welcome the comrades, our dedicated comrades from Pakistan who are here. There are many comrades and sections who are represented, and I do want to individually mention them. The comrades from Bolivia, welcome, comrades. From Brazil, from Colombia, from Chile, from Mexico, from Peru, from Puerto Rico, from Canada, from where else? From Denmark, Argentina, Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, Taiwan, Finland. The United States of America. Yugoslavia. Now, I probably missed someone out here. What do you say? Oh, Britain. Oh, Christ. All right, Johnny. Well, I've heard it. El Salvador. Venezuela. Anybody else? Scotland, Wales, come on, what's the matter with you? Great. There are sections, however, and individuals I cannot mention for security reasons. Sri Lanka? Are the Sri Lankan comrades here? Oh, sorry, this list is first time. Not the first time, but nevertheless, Sri Lanka! Well, it's a genuine gathering of the international representatives of revolution. Well, I've been asked to say, to those watching, please, if you put anything on the media, on social media, use the hashtag RCI24. I would like to inform you that we have received greetings from Comrade Ivan Pinheiro, who is the historical leader of the Brazilian Communist Party. This comrade has led, was part of the Brazilian Communist Party, who were expelled for their ideas and have regrouped in Brazil, are in very friendly relations with our comrades there and ourselves. And we would like to thank Comrade Ivan for his greetings. They are long greetings, which I will not read out, but we will put online for every comrade to read here and internationally. Before we go into the first session on the new manifesto of the International, I have a few important announcements to make. The first one is in relation to photography. Because there are comrades here who come from backgrounds that they do not wish to be known about, shall we say, comrades should not take photographs, but if delegations believe they should take photographs, they should get them, I think, vetted or checked at least by Comrade Maria. Stand here. I think all heads of delegation have Maria's contact details. I think comrades are all aware of the timings, but I'll just go over for your benefit that the morning sessions will begin at 9 a.m. every day, and we will finish for a lunch break at 1 o'clock for 2 hours. In other words, we will return at 3 p.m. We'll also have a break in the morning and in the afternoon in order to, for about 30 minutes, so that you can revive yourselves. And the evening sessions will end at 7:30 when we will have dinner, what I call dinner. It is important to say that all comrades should read, if they haven't read already, the Code of Conduct, because it is vital that we have a smooth running event. And of course, there are a lot of comrades present, so we ask comrades in particular to behave, is perhaps a good word, but to act properly as comrades with each other. For your information, we will vote at the end of this session on the manifesto. In relation to credentials, comrades must keep their credentials on them at all times. There'll be a strict guard at the door, so you won't get in unless you have your credential. Just gives other points, which are not necessarily I can do at the present time. In relation to the setup of stalls, perhaps comrades want to know, that will be done in the first break. And I think Jesse is organizing that. His details are on the forms which have been distributed. Perhaps the comrades are aware by now that I am pausing for translation. Comrades who are looking at different countries are probably a bit puzzled why I'm speaking so slowly. It says here, mentioned, I won't read it out, but yes, we will advertise the Lenin book on war, the collection. Later on, we'll explain what the score is on that. And I think we're all familiar in relation to the eating arrangements, where the Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking, whatever, are banned to the outside area for obvious reasons. And in relation to the first three sessions tomorrow, I've been told to tell you where they are. The first one, The Necessity of Philosophy, is in the main theatre. Is it the main theatre? Oh. How the Bolshevik Party was built in the hotel, and the Russian Revolution is taking place in the gazebo. So, comrades, this is going to be one hell of an event. I'm sure we will thoroughly enjoy it politically, and the fact we're able to talk to comrades from other sections, we haven't been able to do so for a while. So, comrades, enjoy yourself, but don't take it too far. Comrades, it gives me great pleasure in opening the first session of the manifesto to present a comrade that doesn't need any presentation, Comrade Alan Woods.
Pass me a note with 10 minutes to the 20, okay? Event historic time they're not. I don't believe that I am exaggerating when I say that this meeting be a historic meeting, destined to take some very, very important decisions, will have eventually a decisive bearing on the actual results of the classroom in the long run. Now, the subject of my speech is to present the manifesto, which I believe you've all read. But you know, I think that this is a text which speaks for itself. It does not require any further elaboration. But I'd just like to say, Rob mentioned it in his opening, that of course we always think of that great founding comment written by two young men, actually, quite young men. They were very young. Marx wrote this marvelous document in 1847. But that was an historic event. That was an epoch-changing event. Although at the time, the actual numbers of people that supported those were organized, that organ was extremely small, minuscule. And no doubt the writing of this document probably did not have any short run, didn't seem to have any fun. But here we see the most important, the most powerful thing in the world. It's not armies or navies or air forces. It is the power of ideas, great ideas. And no idea is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And you know the most extraordinary thing about the original Communist Manifesto. You think of it, it is truly amazing that sometimes I hear, not usually our own comrades, they're too sensible. Yeah, well, it's all very well, these old ideas. But don't we need new ideas? Well, I'll tell you, I have studied the works of Marxism all my life, a long time. I've also made it my business to study the so-called alternative and the so-called criticism. And I'll tell you this, I have never found any body of ideas, none, that could remotely compare in their profundity, in their scientific exactness, in their sheer brilliance than the ideas of Marx and Engels. And the most extraordinary thing about their manifesto, I'll tell you what it is. Of course, when people say to me, well, surely we need to change with the times. As a dialectical materialist, I must accept that. As a general change, see if certain things will have to be modified, naturally. But comrades, the most extraordinary thing about the ideas of Marxism in general, and the Communist Manifesto in particular, is how little needs to be changed. And that's extraordinary. Think about it. You go on next Monday morning, go to any library, wherever you live, any university library you like, and get any bourgeois book written in 1847 about politics, economics, even history and so on, philosophy. And I will tell you right now, that book will merely be of historical interest, actual relevance to the situation today, actual applicability, zero. Or close to zero. But you read the Communist Manifesto of Marxism. If you haven't read it, you should read it. If you have, read it again. I've read that book hundreds of times, and every time I read it, I learn something new. And what strikes you is this. This book, written in 1846, is not a description of the world of 1847 or 1848. It's not at all. It's a book about today. It's the most modern book that you can read. It accurately expresses the nature of the capitalist system. And although it was written, let's remember, it was written at the time when capitalism was still advancing, was still developing the productive forces. And in a sense, although, as Marx says in Capital, he says, capitalism was born with dripping blood from every pore in its system. That's a fact. Yes. Oh, yeah. You look at the whole of human history. There'll be many blood-soaked civilizations in the past. Many of them. We'll talk about the Aztecs and the human sacrifices. But there's been no more terrible system, terrible crime against humanity, no worse destruction on a massive scale, no more genocide, no greater slaughter of the innocents, little children and so on, in the factories, in wars, countless wars. The Second World War, they're celebrating the anniversary of D-Day now, which is an insult to those brave men and women that died on the beaches in Normandy. It's an insult to their memory. These gangsters, what's his name from America? Biden, that genocide Joe, has the audacity to come and talk about the sacrifice of these young lives. Okay. And all of these gangsters line up, their hands are dyed red with blood. We will deal with their criminal activities in Ukraine, not just in Gaza, but in Ukraine also, and in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, and everywhere, and in Vietnam, you name it. These gangsters, these murderers, have the audacity to stand up and weep crocodile tears about the poor guys who perished on the beaches of Normandy. And by the way, reading these disgusting speeches, that's not a celebration of Normandy. That's the purpose is the opposite. It's not in favor of peace. It's beating the war drums to drum people up for militarization and more wars. And that, my friends, in the modern epoch, is playing with fire. These warmongers, the struggle against militarization and war, is one of the main features of our new epoch and one of our main tasks of this international. But I've come somewhat off what I was going to say. That the capitalist system, it was the most bloodiest system. And yet, in spite of that, you cannot and you must not, if you're serious about analyzing history, not from a sentimental, stupid point of view, but from a scientific point of view, you must understand that despite all these horrors and bloodshed and oppression, the capitalist system nevertheless played an historically progressive role in the only sense that phrase could be understood, because it developed the means of production for a whole period. That's to say, agriculture, industry, science and technique and technology, all those things were developed, of course, at the cost of the blood, sweat and tears of the masses. That's true. But unconsciously, they were not conscious, by their greed for profit and surplus value, they were developing the means of production. And therefore, unconsciously, it wasn't their intention, they were establishing the material basis for a higher society, which is called communism. And that's the whole point. That's why we are entitled to call for the struggle for communism now, because that demand is not only possible. In the past, it was not possible. The material basis was absent. Now the material basis is present with the miracles of science and technology and medicine. And everything. This is not utopian. It's a reality. We already have in our hands all the objective possibilities for creating communism. Yes, we have. It is not just possible. It is an absolute necessity, an objective necessity that flows from objective. And that's the first point that I wish to make. Why do we choose to launch a new communist international? Why have we taken this step? Undoubtedly, it's a very ambitious step, no doubt about it. And some communists would think, well, why now, for example? Why now? Isn't this a bit of a sudden decision? That we've taken a sudden decision. It might seem to be sudden. It wasn't really sudden. Surely, wasn't it arbitrary? Maybe we could have done this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, perhaps. Not at all, comrade. I hope to demonstrate to you in my short time at my disposal, whatever the rationale behind this important decision, whatever the reasons for it, there is absolutely not a gram of arbitrariness involved. It's not an arbitrary decision at all. It's a decision which flows naturally, inevitably from the existing conditions, as I hope to demonstrate. And of course, let's start by emphasizing, we make no apologies for basing ourselves solidly for the old ideas of Marx and Engels. You know, you don't actually have to reinvent the wheel. Not really necessary, I think. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we certainly don't need to reinvent the fundamental ideas of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. That's what we base ourselves on. That's a fact. That's a fact. But now the capitalist, not like 1847 at all, has decisively entered into a phase of senile decay. And there are reasons for that. Let's always bear in mind that there are two fundamental obstacles which prevent the development of, and therefore obstacles in the way of human development, the development of civilization. First, private property of the means of production. Number one, the so-called free market economy. That's the first obstacle which prevents the development. Secondly, that antiquated thing called the nation state, the national state or the national market, I don't care what you call it, it makes no difference actually. Because the markets, even of the biggest country like the USA, it's too narrow to contain the colossal productive potential that exists. So, you know, the question that sometimes people ask me, what is the reason for capitalist crisis? And I would answer, that's the wrong question. The question you ought to ask me is, why isn't the capitalist system always in crisis? Because it's not always in crisis. It's not always in crisis. By the way, there was some development of production even in the 1930s or something. And you have the boom and slump cycles. Are there some mechanisms whereby capitalism can avoid crisis or ameliorate crisis? I answer yes. Yes, there are. The mechanisms are well known, they're not secret. First of all, Keynes explained, you can avoid a slump, a crisis of overproduction, by the government steps in and spends a lot of money. Wonderful. You know, I think there are quite a few students present, and you know, when I was a student, I learned one thing. The most pleasant thing in life is to spend other people's money. Yes, it's whether you credit, you know, credit. Borrow money. Credit cards. It's wonderful. Until it's terrible. One tiny little problem with Keynes's argument. Tiny little problem. Sooner or later, this money must be paid back. And now this is the problem. We'll come to that in a moment. In the last 10 years, or more, last 15 years, since the crisis of 2008, and by the way, I remind you that before this time, all the bourgeois economists, these clever people in the universities with long letters after their names, writing books, what did they say about the state, about the government? The state must not intervene in the economy, must not intervene in the market. Remember that? Do you? I do. No, the market must be left on its own. On its own, the free market will eventually decide. Yeah, fine. On paper, fine. What happened in 2008 when the banks were collapsing everywhere? Did they turn around and say, all right, the market will decide, carry on, the market will decide? No. They came running to the government with their hands out. Save us. And the government obligingly did save them. They did save them. It was Bush at the time, George Bush. The American Commons will excuse my American accent. I'll get into terrible trouble now. How much you want, boys? How much you want? $1 billion? Take $1 billion. 10 billion? Take 10 billion. Yeah. Open checkbook. Take a space. And they did. They took, and they built up a huge mountain of debt. And the private businesses, the corporations did that. Even many workers did that. Middle class people did. Credit. But sooner or later, you know, the moment of truth arrived. This was a very dangerous thing for them to do. And they did the same thing on a bigger scale during the COVID pandemic. Vast amounts of government money was spent. Vast amounts was injected into the economy. Yes. Did it succeed? Yes, it succeeded. Did they avoid a crisis? Yes, they avoided the crisis. And everyone was happy. It's a bit like a drug addict. I'm not speaking from personal experience. I had a very innocent life when I was a young student, at least as far as drugs were. But anyway, a drug addict, you inject some heroin. You feel great. And you need a bigger shot. You feel great again. No problem. You keep on injecting yourself. And then the crisis comes, and in order to save your life, the drugs are stopped. And then you end up in a terrible state. That's the position now. Now, let's put it in a very simple. For the whole of the last period, the capitalist system went beyond its limits, far beyond its limits. And now, of course, they have to pull back. So, everything goes into reverse, and you begin to enter into a downward spiral. All those factors that pushed the economy up are now being pushing the economy down. huge debts on the one hand. I've got the figures here somewhere. I'll deal with the figures in a moment. And vast inflation, which they cannot control, because they're still, although it's gone down somewhat, but it's still present, which means the banks can't reduce the interest rates, and therefore that makes a recession ultimately inevitable. And these debts, by the way, they're absolutely... They make your eyes water. Now, I'm speaking from memory, and communists know my memory is not always very good. But I believe that the total debt of the United States is, I think it was, the latest figure that I heard was 134 trillion. 134 trillion. That's 134 million dollars, which I think is about approximately 130% of the American GDP, which is not much different to Italy, I think. Italian Commons will correct me. Now, nobody talks about this. It's like some very unpleasant personal diseases, particularly affect the male species, which you don't like to talk about in polite society. You don't talk about it. Well, the American debt is like that. Let's talk about it here. Let me tell you, what does this mean? It means that the United States, the most powerful and wealthiest capitalist country in the world, is bankrupt. It's bankrupt. Any other country, they'd be sounding the alarm. But it's not any other country, it's the United States. And they continue to spend money like water, you know. Arms for the Ukraine, arms for Israel. Now they want to pick a fight with China. We'll come to that in a moment. Actually, American imperialism has overreached itself. They've also gone past their limit. That's what happened to the Roman Empire. But part of the reason it was overthrown, it extended itself too much. They went too far. And the question is this: you don't talk about it, perhaps it will go away. It will not go away. I read somewhere, I don't know if it's right, I have to check it. I read somewhere that the US debt is increasing at the astonishing rate of $1 trillion every 3 months. And you can't escape from this. There is such a thing, by the way, as the free market. You know, market forces, these bourgeois are forgotten about. And sooner or later, the markets will inflict what is called a correction on the United States, and it will be a very painful correction. Now, in America, take America as a case. Biden is trying to say that there's an economic recovery. There's a recovery. That's his main slogan to win the elections. I don't see how he can win the election, but he's emphasizing the economy. Everything is fine. The problem is that nobody believes him. Now, this is an important point. Theoretically, the American economy is still advanced, theoretically. But millions of American people, American workers and middle-class people, they don't feel better off. They don't feel prosperous. They feel poorer. The reason they feel poorer is because they are poorer. The prices continue to rise, and therefore it's a struggle to survive. Therefore, you see in America, by the way, I'll come back to this, the beginnings of quite a significant spate of strikes. And you have, of course, the student revolt. I'll come back to these questions later. But this is a general situation. It applies to all countries. Huge debts, and sooner or later, as the Swiss comrades, mountains have avalanches, and that's on the cards. That awaits the capital. It awaits capital. Yeah, but look, even if they avoid a sort of recession, let's say they avoid a slump. I don't see how they can ultimately, but there you are. Doesn't matter. That would not solve their problems, because in all countries now, beneath the surface of apparent, there is a growing feeling of anger, of discontent, of fury, above all of frustration beneath the surface. You can't see it, but it's there. And people feel that they're poor. They're not getting any better. This is bad. Now look, you know, we can make a mistake, and I have seen this mistake made by some of our sections in the past. I will not mention any, but I've seen it. Comrades, the most important question for us in all of this is the question of consciousness of all classes, but above all the consciousness of the working class and the youth. And the mistake comrades sometimes make is this. Let me explain. You cannot understand the change of consciousness purely from the number of strikes or election results or polls or street demonstrations. These are all important facts which we must consider. But there is a deeper process of consciousness, of changing consciousness than that, underneath the surface. But you can't see it. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you know it's there all the time. Now, you know, there is an analogy, I think it's a very precise analogy, between geology and politics, also economics. You know, the Earth's surface seems to be solid, seems to be static. You know, we have an expression in English, I don't know if you have it in another language. As solid as the ground under my feet. You heard that expression? Yeah, the ground seems to be solid, doesn't it? It's not moving. It's still there. Same as yesterday and the day before yesterday. The problem is this, my dear friend. The ground under your feet is not solid, not at all. And beneath the very, very thin surface of rock and earth, which we call the ground, you know how thin this is? You might be surprised if I tell you. It's as thin as a skin on an apple. That's all. That's all that separates us in this room from the most terrifying phenomena you can imagine. Enormous quantities of molten rock, extreme temperatures, and extreme pressure, which is building up all the time, ceaselessly, without stop, all the time. And it's seeking a weak point in the Earth's surface. And sooner or later, takes a long time, geological time. But sooner or later, it will find a weak spot and will burst forth unexpectedly. You can't predict this. You see, geology is a science. I'll deal, in my next lecture, I will deal with the question, is Marxism a science? It is a science. Marxism is a science. It's not an exact science. As geology is not an exact science. You can't predict when an earthquake is going to happen or a volcanic eruption. But you can predict with certainty that earthquakes will take place in such and such a place. An earthquake will take place in such and such. For example, the city of San Francisco, it's a doomed city. Sooner or later, that city will be destroyed in a terrible eruption. The movement of the tectonic plates, which lead to the creation of new continents. And this movement is always accompanied by the most terrific explosions known to man. The same thing applies with society. Beneath the surface of apparent calm, in all countries, without exception, there's a steady growth. There's an enormous accumulation of rage, of anger, and of frustration. Of anger against the status quo. And it's only our tendency that is picked up on. The others are blind. I'll leave them alone. Now, you see, we are now in a situation of the most serious crisis in the history of capital. It's an existential crisis. Doesn't mean to say that the capitalist system will collapse tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Let us be very clear about it. The capitalist system will never collapse of its own accord. Never. The ruling class is determined to keep itself alive. Although it's a decrepit, dying system, but they're determined to stay alive. Even if that means dragging the whole of humanity down into the abyss with it. Don't mind, don't care about it. There's that, and there are other problems which we'll deal with. There are other obstacles which the working class must overcome. But in the final analysis, whether capitalism is overthrown or not, it depends upon the conscious movement of the working class. A revolution. And that, in turn, depends upon the leadership, upon the subjective factor. We'll come to that in later on. But if one looks at the present quality of leadership of the bourgeoisie international, it is quite astonishing. I mean, take Britain, for example. You might say, no, you take Britain. There we are. It's just a matter of opinion. Take Britain. Now, in the course of my long and eventful, I've lived under many governments. Some of them bad, some of them worse, some of them stupid, some of them a bit cleverer. But I've never in my life until now lived under the government of certifiable lunatics. Yeah, but they're not alone, are they? They're not alone. I mean, just look at Biden. Jesus H. Christ. I mean, the mind boggles. I mean, that he is a senile old, decrepit old imbecile is clear. There's no doubt about that. But I begin to believe he's a little bit not quite compos mentis. He's a bit deranged. I'm speaking seriously. He pushes Ukraine, I'll deal with Ukraine in a moment, he pushes Ukraine into an unnecessary and criminal war with Russia, which is obstinately continuing, despite the fact that the war is lost. Everyone knows that the war. But he's still continuing. He's made a complete mess of things in Gaza and the Middle East, and he's still continuing the same policy. I think his understanding of foreign policy is approximately this. If a policy fails, and is seen to be failing repeatedly and catastrophically, what do? Obvious. You continue doing the same policy. That's what he's doing. And not satisfied with that, I think that would be quite enough. He's trying to pick a war with China. I mean, it's just, words fail me. And all of these leaders are just, I mean, look at Macron in France. I think he's a bit deranged as well. He's a bit of a lunatic as well. He wants to be a great world leader. I think Mickey Mouse would be a better candidate. Jesus Christ. Anyway, but let's leave that. Look, all of them are bankrupt, all of them. Well, the ones on the enemy side, they're a bit smarter, I must say that. Look, say what you like about Vladimir Putin. He's a very bad man, he's a gangster, say what you like. But one thing he is not stupid. Same thing can be said of Xi Jinping in China. Not stupid. Anyway, we'll come to that in a moment. But you see now, the question is this. You might think, oh no, Alan, you're attaching too much importance to the individual. Surely we believe in something else, the productive forces, something like that. As if individuals play no role in history. You think that's Marxism? I don't know what it is. Marxism, it certainly is not. History is made by men and women, for God's sake. Can't be made by anybody else. Can't be made by anybody else. And the quality of these people, the quality of leadership, is not a secondary matter. Nevertheless, what I agree with is this. Can we explain the present crises by the stupidity of the leaders? No, you cannot, of course. You cannot explain the crisis by the stupidity of the leaders, but you can explain the stupidity of the leaders by the crisis. That's a fact. Let me put it this way. Even if instead of these idiots, they are idiots, all of them, even if you had clever people, capable, intelligent politics, would it make a difference? Well, yes, it would make some difference, no doubt. Would it make a fundamental difference? No, it would not. Because this crisis cannot be solved. That's the point. They can't solve it. They're thrashing around blindly looking for solutions which are no solutions. Yes, but with good leaders, you might have some effect, establish some kind of a temporary equilibrium, perhaps. With bad leaders, you turn a bad situation into an absolute catastrophe. And that's what you can see with your eyes. That's what you can see now. Absolute catastrophe. One catastrophe after another. And that leadership is very much to do with that. And then if we look at the other possible leaders, take the reformists. You might say, no, you take the... Now, let's be clear. In the past, reformism had a solid base in the mass of the solid base. It made sense. Because in the past, when capitalism was in a phase of upswing, as it was for decades following the Second World War, which was the biggest upswing of the productive forces in the whole of history, including the Industrial Revolution, the capitalist leaders were able to give some concessions in the advanced countries. They were able to give. They gave concessions. Why not? Why not? To blunt the class, And they did blunt it. In America, for example, in Britain, they blunted it for a whole period. And a certain softness began to come into the working class even. That was the classic period of reformism. That's the reason why reformism triumphed in that period. Not because they had clever leaders, they didn't. But the capitalist system was able to give concessions, able to give reforms, important reforms. Now, reformism with reforms makes sense. Workers are realists, makes sense. And therefore, our arguments as revolutionaries could not succeed at that time. Couldn't succeed. We were faced with the solid blocks, the social democracy and the Stalinists, who became like reformists. That was an objective thing. But you see, now what's the position now? The capitalist system is no longer in a position now, no longer in a position to grant new reform. They can't even guarantee the maintenance of those conquests of the past. They can't do it. Therefore, the crisis of capitalism is also the crisis of reformism, because reformism without reforms, reformism with counter-reform, makes no sense to anybody. And therefore you have a crisis of reformism. And what you see at the moment is that a number of elections are taking place right now, as I speak. And you see the European elections, and the bourgeois terrified. They're shouting about the resurgence of what do they call it? The extreme right-wing parties and so on. I don't know whether that phrase is actually correct. Absolutely correct. They are reactionary parties, and no argument of that. Although they have different programs. Like, for example, in Britain they stand for Farage. He aims to be the leader of the Tory party. He stands for free market economics. Whereas I think in Italy, for example, what's her name? Meloni, I think she stands more for state intervention. That's the traditional fascist idea. But they have different... But anyway, the threat that they pose is further instability. And above all, what the bourgeois worried about is the collapse of the center And that is an international phenomenon. The collapse of the political center, which for a long time acted as the glue holding everything together. And this glue is coming apart. And the danger is that leads to polarization, class polarization. That's the danger that this. And the right wing can actually provoke a reaction to the left, which it will, by the way. Everywhere, I'll come back to the elections later, and the question of consciousness, which is the key question. But to go back to the question of international relations, world relations, what we see at the present time, let's express a general, the equilibrium, before there was like an unstable, a temporary equilibrium, which had a certain, partly economic. By the way, I mentioned there were two reasons for crisis. One was private ownership, the other was the nation state, the national market. It's the same thing. And they got around that temporarily by the phenomenon known as globalization. Marx predicted that in advance. An enormous, unprecedented expansion of world trade, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which opened up new markets, and that had a colossal effect. It acted as a driving force for the world economy for a whole period. But that reached its limits probably at the end of the 1990s, I guess, approximate. And ever since that time, it's gone into reverse. Now there's a reaction against globalism and the rise of economic nationalism, summed up in the slogan of America, of Trump. America first, he says. Yes, if it's America first, it's the rest of the world last, obviously. America uses its domination now to grab markets and to assert its domination. It's quite amusing. They've invented a phrase, I don't know if you know this, international rules-based system. Order, I beg your pardon, order, that's right, thank you. What's it mean? Anyone know? Anyone explain to me what it means? I don't know. I couldn't tell you what it means. Or rather, I could tell you what it means. It's not different. Constantly accuse Russia and China and Iran of destroying this wonderful international rules-based order. Okay. Question. Number one, what are the rules? Nobody knows. Nobody can say. And the reason for that is very simple. The rules are made up by the United States of America at their convenience. And these rules can change whenever it suits the Yanks to change them. Now, Blinken just went to China and he lectured Xi Jinping. Just imagine, Xi Jinping is a serious political leader. Antony Blinken is a circus clown. They sent a circus clown to discuss with Xi Jinping. And the circus clown lectured Xi Jinping as if he was a little child. China must stop its trade with Russia because Russia's using this to boost its economy and to carry on the war with Ukraine. All false, entirely false. Now the Chinese, I note, are very polite and they don't normally lose their temper or raise their voice, start shouting. The Americans spend most of their time banging the table and shouting at the rest of the world. I think the American Marines used to have a slogan, didn't they, John? What was it? Speak softly and carry a big stick. Quite an intelligent slogan. Quite clever. But now, I don't know whether they got a big stick or not. I think the stick is shrinking all the time. But they spend the time shouting and bawling and insulting people, you know, like Joe Biden. The man is obsessed with Putin. It's a personal thing. It's like I think he's seen too many of these cowboy films. John Wayne, he thinks he's John Wayne in a cowboy film, shouting and bawling. The problem is Putin. The problem is Putin. Sum total of his knowledge. So they tried it with Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping responded politely, polite language. My knowledge of Chinese is not that great, but I think, as far as I understand it in my translation into Welsh, is the message he sent back to Washington with Blinken was, go and fuck yourself. You're telling China who they can trade with? God, what are you talking? You're talking to us as if we were a little poor nation? We're not. You carry on. So now there's an increasing tension between America and China. That's okay. We'll see how that goes. But this insane policy, what it is, America is trying to assert its power, its global power, at a time when its power is actually limited. Let's be clear, I said it before, repeat it. The Americans deliberately pushed the Ukraine into a senseless war with Russia, which was quite unnecessary. They could have agreed that the Ukraine needn't join NATO. Now Biden's saying, well, perhaps they shouldn't join NATO anytime soon. It's too late for that. And they thought, what were their war aims? They were going to use Ukraine, not their own soldiers. The Ukrainians were going to shed their blood. Use Ukraine as a proxy. They would receive sophisticated sophisticated modern weapons from the US and NATO, they would easily defeat the Russians, who they thought wrongly, very wrongly, were backward with a very poor army and poor weapons and not able to compete. All wrong, quite wrong, quite wrong. Russia has a very powerful army indeed, and instead of the Ukrainians beating the Russians have beat the Ukrainians. The Americans sabotaged every attempt to reach an agreement. They were attempts to sabotage deliberately. They sabotaged the Kiev, the Minsk agreement. They admit that they sabotaged it deliberately. They sabotaged the Istanbul agreement after it had been signed by both the Ukrainians and the Russians. They then pushed the Ukrainians into a senseless offensive last year. Was it last year or the year before? Last year. Give them all these wonderful weapons. You remember that each time there's a new wonder weapon, which is going to be a game changer. You know the expression? It's going to change everything. Like the Leopard tank from Germany. What happened to the Leopard tank? They don't talk about it anymore. It's too embarrassing for the Germans, for the German army. The British, of course, the biggest warmongers of all, they sent them the Chieftain tank. Marvelous tank. Modern, sophisticated, big guns, heavy. Trouble is that the Ukrainian landscape is quite muddy, lots of mud. And these great heavy tanks were sinking in the mud. There were photographs in the British press. Challenger tank stuck in the same thing with the Abrams tank, just blown up, nothing. Patriot missiles blown up. And now they've run out of Patriot. And now they say, oh yes, this offensive failed. Now they admit, at last, failed. Let me tell you something about my knowledge of war. In a war, armies do not fail. They either win or they're defeated. That's what happened. And the Ukrainian army was catastrophically and humiliated, defeated by something they're not prepared to admit. And now the Russians are advancing. They stage another offensive now in Kharkiv. I don't think they want to take Kharkiv. They'll choose their time. And what the Russians are doing is quite clear what they do. They are systematic. They're not engaging in a big offensive. They are systematically using. They have complete control of the air, absolute control of the air. They can bomb and strafe as much as they like. Nothing that the Ukrainians can do about it. Nothing they can do about it. And they are killing very large numbers of Ukrainians, very large numbers. By the way, it is not true that the Russians are having colossal losses. They did have some losses at the beginning, and but they learned. The Russian losses now are relatively small, and most of the losses on the Ukrainians are inflicted by bombs, missiles, and artillery. The figures of Ukrainian losses are horrific. And Zelensky is continuing his madness of driving large numbers of Ukrainians to their death. He can't stop the Russians. He will not stop. And I think I don't know how long this will go on for. Look, the latest wonderful weapon is the F-16 fighter. That's another wonder weapon, which they've been building up again. Once again, they're building this up. The Russians have actually got more advanced fighters than that, but that's a separate. But the thing is, the Ukrainians can't use this aircraft. They can't use it. It's so sophisticated, it requires special strips, aerodromes, which they don't possess. And if they attempt to use Polish or Romanian base, Putin has warned them, you do that and we will target them. Never mind about any target. So the Russians they're steadily advancing. Might seem to you to be not a very dramatic. It's one step. But I wrote an article, I think in January, the fall of Avdiivka, which is a small village, but it was an important place, represented a change in the city. And I said it was the beginning of the end. I think that's correct. As I speak, there's a battle taking place in a small place called Chasiv Yar. It's a very savage and a bloody battle, but it's going to fall any day now. It will, and I think that again will mark. You see, this is precisely a dialectic process. To go back to what I said about avalanche, an avalanche doesn't begin as an. It begins with just a few pebbles being loose. Nothing. Yeah, and those few pebbles continue to tumble, continue to cascade, gathering strength until eventually, suddenly, there's a catastrophic collapse, a catastrophic avalanche. Clausewitz explains that's just what happens in war. I'll make a prediction now. First of all, has the Ukrainian defenses collapsed so far? No, they've still got possibilities. But there's a problem. They're running out of manpower. They've run out of manpower. They can't replace the losses. The Russians can. And therefore, there's a problem. Now they're rounding up people by force, young men being forced into the army against their will. In the early days of the war, there were long queues of people joining the army. That's finished. Now there's a mood of pessimism, of demoralization, of defeatism present in the army, where there's a rebellious mood, but rebellious. And in the Kiev government, there's panic. The report Reports are that Zelensky himself is in a state of panic, shouting and screaming at his generals that you're lying to me, you're not telling the truth. They are telling the truth. In other words, all the ingredients are there for a complete collapse. By the way, the latest money from the States won't make any difference. I can expand upon that if you wish. It won't make any difference. So therefore, I'll make just one prediction. There will be a collapse, perhaps even without a Russian offensive. There'll be a collapse in Ukraine. And that could happen at any time. It will happen suddenly, without warning. And that will be a humiliating defeat for the West and for NATO. Let's look at the other. By the way, one of the symptoms of this crisis is, first of all, it's instability. General instability. Economic instability, diplomatic instability, social instability, military instability. And you see that with the emergence of wars. There's the war in the Ukraine. I spent some time on it because that's a question. There's also the war in Gaza, if you can call it a war. It's not a war, it's a massacre carried out by Israel. With the complicity of the United States, with Biden's stupidity, supporting Netanyahu. Well, he had to support Netanyahu because all US administrations are obliged to. So that was predictable. But did he really have to jump on this old man? Did he have to jump on a plane, a private plane, and rush to Jerusalem to embrace Netanyahu in public and give him, in effect, a blank sheet to do what he wants? He didn't. He didn't have to do that. With the result, now the US is completely discredited, and Netanyahu does just what he wants. What he wants is to continue the war indefinitely. You see, there's a problem here. There's two elections. There's one election in America in November, which I'm sure Biden is going to lose, and I think it's entirely likely that Trump will win. Whether or not he's found guilty of being a criminal or whatever makes no difference. Isn't it amazing? It is amazing. And it's a sign of extreme political instability in America. Until recently, you had two solid columns, the Republicans and the Democrats. That was the guarantee of political stability. Not anymore, particularly with the emergence of Donald Trump. And they are determined to try to stop him from getting elected, the establishment, the ruling class. But they're not able to stop. And you see, in a peculiar way, Trump is a reactionary, it goes without saying. But he's not completely stupid. And he's demagogically plays on this question. Against the establishment, drain the swamp, all this demagogic nonsense. And that connects with millions of people. So I think it's wrong to see the Trump movement, if you will. It is reactionary, but it's wrong to assume that all of these people are reactionary fascists. That's not the case. In a peculiar way, that also expresses the deep discontent or I would say hatred of the existing setup, hatred of the existing establishment. And actually he's going to win. In the US, by the way, you can win even if you're a convicted criminal. I mean, after all, if you look at all the US presidents in the past, most of them, weren't they all criminals? Most of them were, I think. Didn't do them any harm. So he's on. So Biden is afraid he's going to lose the election. And this war in Gaza now has really hurt his chances. I'll deal with the student movement in the States in a moment because that's a key question for us. But therefore, he's losing support in those areas of high percentage of Muslim people and young people. He's lost the vote. Many of them say, we're not going to vote Democrat. We're not going to vote for Biden. Some of them even say we'll vote for Trump. Anything except Biden. So he's desperate that the war should stop, trying to work out all kinds of so-called compromises, which will not work. They haven't worked. They won't work. And the reason they won't work is because Netanyahu will not accept them. I don't think he's a prisoner to his right-wing and nonsense like that. That's not. He's pursuing his own interests. Because the moment that war finishes, he's finished. He's deeply unpopular. So his political future's finished. And also a little problem. He'd probably end up in jail for corruption. So as far as he's concerned, he doesn't care how many people get killed. He continues. This slaughter, this terrible... It is. If it's not genocide, it's something close to it. You see, by the way, what this shows is the limits of American power. The Americans are desperately trying to put pressure to stop this war because it doesn't suit them. And they can't control their own puppet. So therefore, this appalling slaughter will continue for the time being. Netanyahu says, until Hamas is completely destroyed. Hamas will not be completely destroyed, beyond his capabilities to do that. So these horrors will continue. Now we all know about the horrors of war. We don't need lectures of pacifists to know that war is a terrible thing, that it means terrible suffering for millions of people. We know this. But that's not all that war does. All history shows us that war can produce revolution. War can produce revolution. It usually does, one way or the other, sooner or later. That's what happened in 1917, isn't it? Yes. Or 1918 in Germany and Austria and so on. It's implicit. Now, look at the position in the Middle East. Those reactionary Arab regimes, like Jordan, always supported the United States. The Jordans were very stupid to support the Israelis against the Iranian missiles. That was a bad mistake. But the masses in these countries are enraged. They're furious, naturally. They see the daily slaughter of men, women, and children on the televisions, and that affects them very deeply, and therefore they're on the move, they're on the streets, they're demonstrating and so on. They're very angry demonstrating. And if this slaughter continues, it is entirely possible that one or more of these regimes is going to be overthrown. That's one element. This must be worrying the strategist capital. But more worrying still is the effect that this war has had in the United States, as shown by this marvelous movement of the students, which is very similar. I remember the Vietnam War very well. It's very similar to the effects of the Vietnam War. Huge movement. And this is taking off all over the United States. And all the acts of repression, all that the repression is doing, it's been quite brutal repression, because America is a democracy. Like Israel, there's also repressing demonstrations, another democracy. But the repression only serves to make people more angry, more radical, more politicized, and therefore this is an important ingredient, very important. And you see how it spreads, like Vietnam, it spreads to Canada, France, Paris, to Britain, even Australia, and it continues to grow. And this presents our international with its first opportunity, which I'm pleased to say we've grasped with both hands. And the point about it is this: what does this movement represent? Now, you might say, if you're a stupid sectarian, which I hope you are not, it's just the students, it's only middle-class students. The working class is the thing, the working class is the thing. Okay, but you see, in all of history, look at history, it's practically a law that revolutionary movements always start with that layer, with the students, intellectual youth, and so on. It was the case in Russia, and it's the case in the States. It was the case in France, 1968, don't forget. Now, I don't wish to exaggerate the role of students. We're not studentists. We stand firmly on a proletarian base. But nevertheless, students can play a very important role as a catalyst, if you like. And what does this movement represent? Well, of course, it represents the natural feelings of revulsion and hatred of the horrors, the atrocities being perpetrated by Israel in Gaza. That's true. But it's not just that. These gangsters, these people, so-called leaders, self-elected leaders of the Palestine movement. I don't know who elected them. Nobody knows. They just appear and they say, well, we're the leaders. And they want to control everything, and they want to stop the movement from becoming radical. By the way, they use identity politics as a tactic for combating revolution. They say only Palestinians can speak. Well, there aren't any Palestinians around at the moment. It doesn't matter. This kind of nonsense. There must be no politics, no communism. Can't sell your paper. Can't use your slogans. Nonsense. Nonsense. Where our comrades have intervened and they've ignored this trash. The young people, the great majority of young people, including the Palestinians and the Muslim youth and so on, are very enthusiastic and very open. They have no problem. And they're interested in not just in the Palestine, but they're interested in revolution, and they're interested in communism. We've proven this in practice. Okay, so that's a huge opportunity for us. In Britain, I think this will be discussed later on in the next few days. I won't dwell upon it. We've had a huge breakthrough with the intervention of Comrade Fiona Lally, which I think you know about, who in a public debate on television smashed the best-known leader of the right wing of the Tory party, Suella Braverman, former Home Minister, smashed. And this went viral with millions, I think 5 million hits, I'm not sure. It's more than that now. It's more than 10 million. A huge response, including in the Middle East with Arab, it's been published with Arab subtitles. And as you probably know, at this moment that I'm speaking now, that's why Fiona's not here. We decided, which is an exception, it mustn't be taken as a rule. It was for particular circumstances. We decided to put her, or just her, forward in one part of London, working class part of London, where there's a big Muslim population, to put her forward as a candidate of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Although for technical reasons we couldn't put the party immediately on, we put it. She's got to stand as an independent formally, but everyone knows that she's standing for our party. Now, That's just an example of the enormous possibilities and an enormous change in consciousness, which only our tendency, only our international was able to detect. Nobody else. When everyone else, all these so-called Trotskyists, these sectarians on the fringes of the movement, and the left reformists, all of them were going around weeping into their herbal tea, moaning, how terrible things are. Everything is black, everything is reaction, nothing is to be done. It reminds me of a poem by Edward Lear with a very amusing cartoon. What does it go? You can't difficult to translate this. There was an old man of Cape Horn, Cabo de Cuerno. There was an old man of Cape Horn who wished that he'd never been born. So he sat on a chair till he died of despair. That miserable old man of Cape Horn. And that's what, just a poem. But I mean, these people are consumed with the poison of pessimism, consumed with the poison of skepticism, consumed actually with the poison of cynicism, lack of faith in communism, lack of faith in the working class, lack of faith in the revolutionary youth, and lack of faith in themselves. That's understandable, of course. Perfectly understandable. No comments. Look, we were the only ones to see this, for God's sake. And the message is, I'll go back to what I said earlier about consciousness. You do not and cannot measure changes of consciousness of the masses purely in terms of strikes and demonstrations or even elections. Beneath the surface, there is this powerful subterranean, this movement of the youth, for example. The students, naturally, cannot play an independent role in the class struggle. That's ABC stuff. Little child knows that. We don't have to be told that. Yes, but after ABC, there are other letters in the alphabet. You have to learn these other letters. Students can't play an independent role, but they can play a role, and it can be an important role under certain circumstances. Because, I'll tell you why, because they are a very sensitive barometer of the moods that exist in society, the tensions in society. They express this. And because of this sensitivity, they can express this mood in an open way before anybody else. But this mood, it is not just a question of the Palestine question. It's not just a question of Gaza. It isn't. It's part of a general malaise and frustration and hatred against the status quo in general. One of the most incredible things about this election campaign, which we are holding now, is we are getting an astonishing response from young Muslim women. A huge response. And that's not an accident. These are people that are oppressed doubly and triply. They see in Fiona a role model. Some of our comments are a bit narrow in their approach to politics. Oh yeah, well you can't have too much personality and there's too much Fiona, too much pictures. No, and furthermore, no. Look, I'll tell an ABC consideration. The mass of people always personify a party or a movement, always. They don't understand abstraction, abstract editorials, abstract articles, anonymous central committees. They understand people. The Bolshevik Party was known as the party of Lenin Trotsky. Their pictures were known, their photographs were known. And I well remember during the Vietnam War, the American Communist Party built up the person of Angela Davis, who was completely unknown. Her photograph, a black woman, it was seen everywhere. And it became recognizable, a recognizable symbol. Now, for the first time, we are beginning to do serious mass work. This means a dialogue with the masses, not the narrow layer of activists that we're used to dealing with, but ordinary people who never read any of our material, don't know us, don't know our ideas, and they have to be convinced. But for the first time that I can remember, there's a very broad audience of people that want to be convinced. And that's the most important point. That brings us back to the manifesto, and it brings us back to the purpose of this meeting. We have this opportunity, which we must seize. And there is a change. I've got here many, unfortunately, I won't have much time, but allow me a moment. I've got a question. Oh, yes. This chain, we've understood. Some of the more intelligent bourgeois strategists also are beginning to understand. For example, there was just an article published in Britain a few weeks ago, and it is by a man called Frost, David Frost. Where are we? I've lost my bloody page. Rob, you pinched my page. What have you done? Never mind. Where are we? He actually published an article with the title, right-wing bourgeois paper, "The mood of the public in Britain has developed a mood for revolution." This is the title of the article. The people of Britain, he says, are in a revolutionary mood. Now, as it happens, I think that's a slight exaggeration. We're not quite there yet. But what this leading Tory, but leading Conservative, what he says is based on something. Now, for example, there's an election taking place in Britain at present, and the mood is very peculiar. On the one hand, the Tory government is hated. What's the percentage they got? No, but what's the percentage? 12%, 25%. He's supposed to know, this guy. What am I asking for? I think that the Tories, I don't think they got 25% of the pardon. At last, a sensible voice. What is it? Speak up, comrade, I can you. The Tories in the polls now have got 17% catastrophic collapse. Yes, but at this, I don't know what they get in the final vote, but it will be a catastrophic collapse. Yes, but there's no enthusiasm for Labour, no enthusiasm for Starmer whatsoever. And therefore, it's a strange thing. Maybe quite a few people will abstain. I think in the end, many people will vote Labour just to get rid of the Conservatives. That's possible. But this hostility to politics, Frost deals with it. You might think that's apathy. It's not apathy. And he explains. Frost says the following. The truth is, he says, that most voters pay almost no attention to politics, apart from a few days around the election. He goes on. I don't blame them. It's absolutely rational and reasonable to do this. But it doesn't happen, he says, out of lack of interest. This is his words. It happens because people have switched off from the Westminster game, professional politics. He says, this isn't apathy, it's a total loss of confidence in the system. This is a Tory leader speaking. And he's right. Well, another pollster called James Frayne writes, I cannot remember a more disillusioned and angrier electorate. People are angry. Not just angry against the Conservatives either. They are angry. And this, would I express this? You see, most people, they haven't read any books, they don't know us, they don't know what we stand for. But most people feel in their heart, in their guts, they feel strongly that something in society is badly wrong, that this is not right. What's happening is not right. And this is what Trotsky, this is actually the beginnings, the embryo of revolutionary consciousness, what Trotsky expressed in a marvelous, profound, where he referred to the molecular process of social, in which you get, like in geology, this gradual build up and build up and build up of one thing and another thing and another thing, until eventually it expresses itself as a sudden change, sudden expression, which is a revolution. Now, what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, first of all, that in a period like this, enormous changes can and will occur when they are least expected. Comrades, we must expect the unexpected. To put it concretely, we must be prepared. Now, the radicalization is not confined to the students. You've got very significant developments. You've had mass strikes, racial strikes in America. Very interesting public declaration by a man called Sean Fain, who's the president of the UAW. That's the powerful, the United Auto Workers. Very powerful. Who made the following statement. By the way, he supported the students against repression about the Palestine movement. His union organizes thousands and thousands of workers in the union. He says, the UAW will never support the mass arrest for intimidation of those exercising their right to protest, strike, or speak out against injustice. So on he goes. But on May Day, the same union, the UAW, released a video, quite an extraordinary video, where this man actually calls for a general strike in America. He says the following. It's true that it's really a thing, you might think but there's an explanation. He says the following. We invite other unions to align their contract aspiration, I beg your pardon, to align their contract aspiration dates with our own. The state American unions, they've got like contract dates to expire at a certain time. And he's calling on all unions to unite their contracts with his union, which would come together on the 1st of May 2028. But that's because that's when the contracts expire. But he says the following, I quote the actual words. We want a general strike. We want everyone walking out, just like like they do in other countries. Together we can begin to flex our collective muscle. Now, to be clear about it, this man is not a Marxist and he's very confused and he makes contradictory declarations. All that's true. But I can't remember the last time when a leader of a major American union made a statement like that. Can't remember. And that must surely represent something in the working class. The beginnings of something big in the United States. Therefore, I'm saying this movement is not just about Palestine. That's wrong. And our duty is to expand it to general demands for a revolutionary change of society. Now, you see, you have this colossal possibility. Of course, it's not uniform. Different layers of the class draw different conclusions at different times. And of course, at this stage, the most advanced layers is the youth. That's why we must base ourselves on the youth. Lenin said, he who has the youth has the future. Some people say, oh no, the working class, the unions and so on. The Labour Party, the unions. Comrades, my first observation is the working class is not the unions, nor is it the Labour Party. And I'll be clear. Let's be clear about it. We do not write off either the unions or the Labour Party. We don't do that. We don't make that sectarian mistake. And we will continue to work in these organizations and we'll continue to put demands on them, as we always have done. That's what Lenin advocated very clearly. You know, one time when Ted Grant, our leader and teacher and founder of this organization, towards the end of his life, he said to me, Alan, he said, I don't know why Lenin wrote so many books, because nowadays nobody reads them. And if they do read them, they don't understand a single word of it. I think that's quite fair, by the way. You see a general bankruptcy of this, and this is the point. You have all these possibilities. And who's giving it an expression? Sometimes people talk about the mass organizations and the mass organizations. Well, okay. Don't worry, comrades. We are not going to forget about the mass organizations. We'll pay them due attention. But as Ted used to say, every vegetable has its season. Okay? And if you ask me, what about now at this moment in time, in Britain, for example, the average trade union branch meeting, is that really a reflection of the mood of the working class? Well, I will leave it to our trades union comrades to answer that question. But in general, what I will say is this, and I insist on this, at this moment in time, this powerful mood, this mood that exists in society, that the Tories have seen, that Dave Frost has seen, finds no expression in the mass organizations. Zero. By the way, that's not something that we predicted years ago. We always assumed that the masses would turn in the first place to the mass organizations and there would be the emergence of a left wing. Well, that can still happen. It happened in Britain unexpectedly with Jeremy Corbyn, for a short time. And Jeremy and Corbyn could have changed the whole situation. He had it in his hand, in his power to do that. Hundreds of thousands of people were joining the Labour Party looking for a left alternative. What's the problem? The problem is one of leadership. The problem is one of the subjective factor. And Jeremy Corbyn, like all the left reformists, like the other guy, Bernie Sanders in the States, the same story, he had a possibility to set up a third party. But all these left reformists, in the last analysis, are not capable of conducting the struggle with the right wing to the end. That's the problem. They're afraid. They're afraid of the sound of their own voice, afraid of their own shadow. And they run away from a fight. That's the truth of the matter. Arguing that for the sake of unity, we mustn't have splits, we mustn't divide the movement, and nonsense of this sort. Instead of telling the truth that the right-wing reformists have no place in this movement because they're agents of the capitalist class. And they should be driven out, expelled and driven out with sticks and stones. No arguments. They didn't do that. Preached sweetness and light and all the rest of it. We must all love each other. And therefore, they handed the power in the Labour Party over to Starmer and the right wing, which was a crime. And, of course, Starmer thanked them adequately for their betrayal, for their seller. That's what it was. It was a betrayal. He thanked them by kicking them out, all of them, staging a vicious purge against the left wing as a conscious and deliberate representative of capital. He understood what needed to be done. Get rid of the left. Where's the left? The left did not. And that's the problem with left reform. And by the way, when I refer to weakness, I'm not referring to this as a personal thing. Personal weakness, personal cowardice. No, nothing of the sort. This is not a personal question. It's not a psychological question. It's embedded deeply into the DNA of left reformists. Because in the last analysis, the left reformists do not have a fundamental disagreement with the right reformists, actually. Because they all accept the existence of the capitalist system, all of them. Only some are more conscious and deliberate, and others are completely utopian, actually, demanding that the capitalist system should be gradually reformed into something different. And they have the insolence, to describe us communists as utopians. And they are realists. Where do they get realists? It must be realistic, you know. Comrades, please be realistic. Yeah. You know what sort of a realism that is? It's the realism of a man who tries to teach a man-eating tiger to eat lettuce, you know. Have you ever tried that? Have you ever tried it? Have you ever tried it? No? No. You should, you know. Of course, you will not teach the tiger to eat lettuce, but he will eat you. That's the sort of, these fools. It's the worst form of utopianism, reactionary utopianism. And we must explain this in very clear language. But that phase of left reformism is finished. It's finished. As also finished in Greece with Tsipras, also finished in Spain with Podemos. It's finished. And therefore, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do in a situation like this? I mean, it's a concrete question, not an abstract question. Of course, you've got the communist parties, which under the present circumstances, they should be growing rapidly everywhere. Well, they get some growth only because they have the name communism. Now, the most important thing for us is that a very large number of young people, even very young people, the other day we received a very nice letter from a school kid in Britain, 12 years old, saying, I'm a communist and I would like to join your party. Will you please let me in? The only trouble might be my age. 12 years old. It's not a problem. But poll after poll has shown, in country after America, in Canada, in Britain, even Australia, that there is a sizable number of young people who now consider themselves to be communists. These have drawn conclusion, the correct conclusion from the situation. And they conclude that nothing is good enough except communism. Even socialism, even the word socialism is no good. It's not adequate. It smells of reformism, frankly, of betrayal. No. These young people, they want communism. And therefore, it should be an easy task for us, if we are bold, we show the necessary determination to recruit these people. By the way, we are talking about, according to these figures, these percentages, we're talking about millions of young people. And there is, by the way, there's a huge vacuum now on the left, a huge vacuum. So-called communist parties, well, there's a problem with them. It's a small difficulty, a small problem. They have nothing whatsoever to do with communism. They've abandoned They've abandoned any pretense at standing for communism in the sense that Lenin understood it. They're communists in name only. I'm not referring to the rank and file. Doubtless there are many honest workers and youth in their ranks that we must address ourselves to. But in the great majority of cases, the leaders of these parties have long ago abandoned Leninist ideas and become another version of the social democracy of reformists, left reformists in the best case. There are exceptions like the Kukue in Greece that has definitely made progress with Sidda. But in general, it's not the case. Other people like that. In Brazil, we had a very good relation with the communists there, and Pinheiro and others. And we will maintain friendly relationship discussion with them. But there's a lot more I could say, but I don't. The question is, what conclusion can we draw from these? In my view, there's only one conclusion is possible. We must now boldly strike out in a new direction and boldly raise the banner of a new party, because frankly, young people don't understand anything else. They understand party. And for a communist, a revolutionary communist. And it will be easy, very easy to win these young people to our ranks. We can grow rapidly. We are growing rapidly. But here I must issue a word of warning. And it's a very serious warning. Once you win a young person, joins the party, that is not the end of the process, the beginning of it. You win somebody, you don't just sit back and say, well, that's that job done. Let's win somebody else. You must win these. And you must educate them in theory, which still remains our fundamental task. No good winning a young person. Otherwise, if you don't do that, I'll tell you what will happen. You get rapid growth, and at a certain point, these people will go through our fingers. We will lose them. You win them and you train them. And the two things are not contradictory. They're not contradictory. They must proceed absolutely at the same time. Communists know that I like to quote the Bible. I must get one quote. I got a few in the other day at the IEC. I sneaked them in. But And you know what quote I'm going to give, don't you? You've heard it before, haven't you? You're going to hear it again, because repetition is the mother of learning. Look around at the wretched state of all the sectarian idiots, tend to be Trotskyists, lamentable spectacle. Like unto the man who builded his house upon the sand, and the wind came, and the rain, and it beat upon that house, and the house fell. And great was the fall of it. Great was the fall of it, says it. It goes on to say, we must be like the wise man. Built his house upon the rock, and the wind came, and the rain, and it beat upon the house. And the house fell not, because it was built upon the rock. Of course, the rock which Jesus Christ was referring to is the rock of religious faith. Well, we have no place for religious faith. We don't need any such thing. Our rock is the solid rock of Marxist theory, which this international alone, for decades has been fighting to maintain. That is what has guaranteed the success we've got at the moment. We hadn't have educated a whole layer of cadres, we couldn't do the work we're doing now. And therefore, this important work must continue. It's an absolute priority. And there's no problem here. Comrades, I guarantee to you that among these young people that are looking for us, they're looking for us, yes, they're looking for this organization as I speak. There's a thirst for theory. They want to learn, they want to know. And we have to provide these wonderful ideas, because that is our real strength. In fact, it's the only thing that entitles us to exist as an independent movement, the strength of these ideas. And therefore, comrades, we can be fully confident in the correctness of these ideas. It's been fully demonstrated. We have every confidence, full confidence. Leave the pessimism to the circus clowns. Leave them alone. Let them drown in their own sea of misery. For our part, we have complete confidence. Confidence in our ideas. Wonderful ideas of Marxism. As Lenin said, Marxism is all-powerful because it is true. That is confidence in the ideas, confidence in the working class, the only class that can change society. Confidence in the millions of young people that are looking for communism, that are looking for our organization. Last but not least, confidence in ourselves, the only people that have maintained the banner of communism under difficult conditions, and the only people that can succeed in building the necessary organization nationally and internationally, which is the only ultimate guarantee of success in the struggle of the workers to change society. Comrades, long live Marxism, long live communism, long live the Revolutionary Communist International. So, I gotta get up in a minute. Oh, Christ. Oh. Criminals of want, for reason in revolt thou thunders, and at last ends the age of Kant. Then away with all your superstitions, servile masses, arise, arise. We'll change forth the old conditions and swell the dust to win the
Great lead-off, or a great subject. San Francisco, though, comrades better move, I think. I have an announcement here in relation to COVID. Obviously, we have to be very careful. That anyone, it says, who develops cold or flu symptoms need to get themselves tested for COVID. There's a medical desk, I believe, at the very back outside the hall that you can get test kits. Just there. If you are positive, you must stay out of the meeting rooms. Test positive. You have to eat outside with the Anglo-Saxons. It's a bit, I think you get the idea, outside anyway, away from the Anglo-Saxons.
Bueno, comes fuera,
And,
lejos de los anglosajones.
and wear a mask at all times.
Utilizar mascarilla, todo.
Again, these masks can be available at the medical
Las
desks.
mascarillas están disponibles en esa
But it
médica
says that if you have symptoms but
Tienes
test
síntomas.
negative,
y ha salido negativo.
you must wear a mask when you're inside at all
Debes
times.
usar la mascarilla cuando estás bajo techo en todo momento.
Okay, comrades, well, we'll have a break now for half an hour, so
Descanso de
come
media
back
hora.
by
Regresar
about 20 past 12.
A las 12:20.
Comrades, wish. Make your way in, comrades. Good start.
Yo no he escuchado que habías pedido, pregunté a 2, 3, no, no habló nada, pero se me...
Followed by Tom, the United States. Get the both of them in before.
The dissolution National Assembly. New elections will be held in 3 weeks' time. It's a consequence of the results of the European election yesterday, which was a complete rout for Macron's party, less than 50% in the context of 48% of. And it was a big victory for the extreme right-wing party of Marine Le Pen. Had no other option really but to dissolve the National Assembly. Because you have to remember that it doesn't have an absolute majority in the National Assembly. It's been the case for 2 years. And the vote of no confidence was on the order of the day in the following weeks or even days. So Macron decided to anticipate and to pretend to control the process. It must be said that Macron tried his best to avoid this electoral defeat road. But after 7 years of economic crisis, of severe counter-reforms, of cuts in the massive cuts in public spendings, of the systematic destruction of the public services, of repression in the streets, of inflation, etc., of supporting Israel, Macron could not convince many people to vote for his party. So he tried his last card. 2 months ago, he announced that, insisted that he would send the French troops on the ground in Ukraine. And he even threatened Russia with a nuclear war. Of course, it's not just an electoral tactic. The interests of French imperialism are involved there, especially because imperialism is in decline, is in crisis in Africa especially. But Macron had no choice but to insist on that in the hope that it would mobilize some people to vote for him on the nationalist line. This crazy move was not very successful among NATO leaders, but nor was it very successful among French voters, who did not enjoy the perspective of a nuclear war with Russia, as you can understand. No, now why has Le Pen party won the European election? It's quite simple. Because the so-called left is in a deep crisis. The deep crisis Alan has referred to, the crisis of reformism Alan mentioned in his lead-off, explained. The Socialist Party, the Greens, the Communist Party, they have spent most of their times attacking not the right-wing and the extreme right-wing parties, not the ruling class, but Mélenchon's party. The leader of the French Communist Party went as far as calling Mélenchon an anti-Semite publicly. And the Greens and the SP didn't deny. They do the same. They sing the same song. They have completely capitulated to the bourgeois pressure on every question, starting with the Gaza war. As for Mélenchon, who had accumulated some support on the left during the last 5-10 years, he has spent most of his time during the 2 last years calling for the unity of the left. That is the unity with the Communist Party, the Greens, and the Socialist Party that are calling him an anti-Semite and everything else. The whole thing is a complete circus that average workers cannot understand what's going on. And this crisis of the reformists is what opened the road for the electoral successes of the Marine Le Pen's party, the extreme right-wing party. Now, there is a good chance that this party will win the next general elections in 3 weeks' time. All the surveys say that. The traditional bourgeois party, Les Républicains, since yesterday is clearly moving in the direction of a government of coalition with Marine Le Pen. They said to Macron, we will never go into a coalition government with you, but they didn't say they wouldn't go with a government of coalition with Le Pen, which says everything. And some MPs are already calling for a coalition government with the extreme right-wing party. All the right-wing parties together, they have a chance to win this election precisely because the left is so pathetic and because Mélenchon doesn't want to break with the right-wing reformists. This is something we explain often, that the left wing of reformists, they are unable to break with the right-wing reformists. And it's perfectly clear in the case of France. Mélenchon is afraid, you can see he's afraid of being the dominant force on the left. He needs someone on his right. And he's ready to artificially keep these people alive while they're dying, instead of being alone on the left. But a victory of the right and the extreme right next month, and a government led by Marine Le Pen's party, will only prepare a new and sharp turn to the left. Already the youth is getting more and more radicalized, as everywhere. Yesterday night there were spontaneous demonstrations of young people in many cities, or at least in Paris. I don't know about many cities. Paris, probably elsewhere. And the victory of Marine Le Pen would be a source of destabilization and stability, political, but in the streets also. The youth would mobilize. Recently, a survey was done among the young people French young people between 18 and 24 years old. They were asked, who would you vote for if a presidential election was organized tomorrow? 40% said Mélenchon, and 10% said for one of these extreme right, left-wing parties, big sects on the left. And among those who said they would vote for Mélenchon, there's a lot of them are very critical of Mélenchon already, but they would vote for him because he is the only one who can win at this stage. And for the French section of the International, it's perfectly clear. We are going to build the organization in this layer of young people moving far to the left. And this is where we're going to build the Revolutionary Communist Party that will be founded next November. Thank you.
The U.S. is the most powerful imperialist country in the world, but as Trotsky said, it's a giant with clay feet. There's serious crisis inside the United States, including economic and political. Bourgeois institutions are hated, and the illusions that the working class used to have in these institutions are starting to burn away. There's enormous anger against Joe Biden, who, as Alan said, is now known as Genocide Joe for his support of Israel in war on Gaza. This anger, for example, plays out in a state like Michigan, which has a very large Arab American population. Many of these people will not vote for either of these candidates. This probably means that Michigan would therefore vote for Trump, which would help Trump get elected. There's no way I could see Biden getting reelected without Michigan. Even if Trump doesn't get more votes than Biden, he can win in the Electoral College because that is biased to the rural petty bourgeois states. Now, the ruling class is trying to scare people. They're trying to say if Trump gets elected, he's going to establish a dictatorship. But if Trump gets elected, it's not going to be a dictatorship. It's going to open up a period of extreme instability, political, social, and otherwise. We can guarantee that the first night he gets elected, there are going to be protests in the streets, particularly among the youth. Now, some comrades have seen that Trump was convicted a few weeks ago. Now, Trump said that the judicial system was rigged against him. Now, the truth is, the judicial system is rigged against the working class, is rigged against the labor movement, is rigged against racial minorities, but it's not rigged against Trump. Trump has been breaking the law for decades, and they never went after him until he started to interfere with the plans of the ruling class. Just for those comrades who ask, Trump can run and win and be elected to president even if he's in jail, which I don't expect he will be. Politicians in the United States are producing anger and producing an increase in class struggle. About 9 million Americans work 2 or more jobs to make ends meet, and 78% of Americans work paycheck to paycheck. 4.5 years ago, what would have cost you $1 now costs almost $2. Homelessness is at record levels in the United States today. According to the government figures, which I don't think are, I think they underestimate the problem, homelessness just in New York City is up 175% over the last 20 years. And homelessness around the country, they estimate that at least 650,000 people live in either shelters, tents, cars, or just outdoors. Even small towns now, they have areas where there are people who live in tents, and then the police come and arrest them. This has created a rise in the class struggle where according to polls, 70% of the population approves of unions. Major strikes have increased, like from 2022 to 2023, went from 43, it jumped 43%. That included big strikes like the writers' strike, the actors' strike, and the auto workers' strike. Also, there have been efforts to organize the unorganized, like at Amazon, auto factories in the South, Apple, and Starbucks. But these organizing campaigns have had mixed results. And the reason is the American ruling class has set up these laws. They said, you want to organize a union, you have to follow these laws. Problem is, the laws are written so that you will not be able to establish a union at that particular workplace. The U.S. labor movement has dealt with this problem before. Like, for example, back in 1934. That year, Trotskyists in Minneapolis, the American Workers' Party in Toledo, Ohio, Communist Party in San Francisco, all led successful organizing campaigns and strikes. Those campaigns were successful because they didn't obey the law. They relied on mass action, mobilizing and organizing the masses, not just the strikers, but support around the strikers. The U.S. labor movement is going to have to relearn and rediscover those traditions and use them in the future if it wants to be successful. In that context, as Alan explained, the anger from below has created some changes in the union leadership. Shawn Fain is the new leader of the United Auto Workers Union, and he has made some positive improvement. His union supported a resolution calling for a ceasefire in the war in Gaza. They also took a harder line in the auto negotiations that occurred last fall. He started a campaign to organize the unorganized auto factories in the South. And as Alan said, he's put out a call for unions to try to get their contracts to expire for May Day 2028, linking this with a call for a general strike on that May Day. We are going to use these points in our work. We're going to advocate, certainly in our comrades in the unions, that they get their union to have an expiration date on April 30th, 2028, and connect that with a call for a general strike, and to show the power of the labor movement in the United States if it did go on a general strike, what it could accomplish. But unfortunately, we also have to show the limitations of someone like Shawn Fain. For example, in the auto strike last fall, he implemented this idea of a stand-up strike, which meant only some workers went out on strike while others continued working. If he had taken all the workers out and then tried to spread the strike to related industries, especially when the actors and the writers were on strike at the same time, more could have been gained from that contract. He's also trying to organize the unorganized auto factories in the South, but he's doing it according to the government rules, which led them to have one victory at Volkswagen, but a defeat at the Mercedes plant. We'll see how the campaign plays out, but it's going to be harder and harder for him to succeed in these other plants that are located in the South. The biggest mistake he made was he took the UAW and endorsed Joe Biden for re-election. In fact, at the union meeting where they had Joe Biden there were members who were protesting policy in Gaza, and the union security, were pressing their own members from this protest. So it's a contradictory process. On the one hand, he's taken a lot of steps forward, but there are also some negative steps as well. But this also leads us to this movement that's developed on the campuses to fight against the war on Gaza. Now, it's interesting. This started at some elite schools, Ivy League schools like Columbia University in New York. But it didn't just stay there. It spread to other private universities and public universities as well. One of the most interesting developments was that at UCLA, was a public college in California, the peaceful student protesters were attacked by Zionist right-wing elements, the police, and the campus security. Marx says that sometimes the revolution needs the whip of reaction. And this is what happened in this instance. Because one of the UAW locals that represents university workers decided to take a political strike in reaction to this. And you don't see political strikes very often recently in the United States. Comrades, my time has expired, but I want to say the United States working class must build its party, a mass communist party. This will involve many steps and stages, but the first step is the founding of the RCI, and this July when we found the Revolutionary Communists of America.
Halves. The Anglo-Saxon speakers, that is the English speakers, our American cousins and Canadians, the British and the Irish, I think that's about it. Anybody else here? We will have our lunch outside where the gazebo is, like we had this morning at breakfast. Everyone else will have their lunch inside the hotel, like last night. Now, before you go, there's been a couple of cases of COVID, commoners who tested positive. They have their own room to begin with, so that's good. They will be given a few minutes earlier to go to lunch. I think they have gone, so they can eat their lunch a bit separately. They will be in the gazebo area with the Anglo-Saxons. But they'll have their own table. Presumably they'll have their own masks on, but how the hell they're going to eat, I don't know. But to be seriously, obviously they know who they are. They must ensure comrades don't go near them as far as we can. I don't know if we could put a cross on something, I don't know. But we won't go that far. But it is a serious point. We have to be very careful, try and contain this, and therefore take the necessary measures. Again, if anybody has any symptoms, see the comrades on the medical table outside here. Because the main thing is to keep safe, and also if you're feeling you need a mask, there are also masks available. Okay, comrades, with that, I'll give a few other announcements later on, but that's sufficient for now. We'll come back at 3 o'clock.
What I have in my hands is workers, a country's main trade union organization, whose general secretary, very famous Miners Federation, with at its Congress.
Que incluso se busca en los camaradas de México están vendiendo
bolivianos.
Los camaradas de Bolivia están a vender las tesis de Pulacayo, ¿no?
Which incidentally, if you want to get a copy of these theses, they are on sale by the comrades from Bolivia.
Y esta federación, estas tesis de Pulacayo, son prácticamente una adaptación del programa transicional de la Cuarta Internacional a la situación boliviana.
And these Pulacayo theses are basically the adaptation of the transitional program of the Fourth International to Bolivian conditions.
Esto fue en la época en que los trotskistas jugaban un papel dirigente en el movimiento.
Because at that time the Trotskyists played a leading role in the movement, in the workers' movement in Bolivia.
Y como saben, los trotskistas estuvieron a punto de tomar el poder en...
And they could have taken power in 1952 during the Bolivian Revolution.
Pero décadas después, en el inicio del siglo XXI, en la lucha contra la privatización de la agua y de los hidrocarburos.
At the beginning of the 21st century, in the struggle against the privatization of water and gas,
Nuestros camaradas de Brasil, con el movimiento de fábricas ocupadas, participaron activamente de este movimiento en Bolivia y la ocupación de las minas y todo.
some of our comrades from Bolivia participated actively in this movement as representatives from the occupied factories movement in Brazil. They participated in this movement in Bolivia.
Y lo que pasa es que Serge, que era el camarada Serge, que está aquí presente, que participó de este movimiento, lo rindieron un homenaje, lo regalaron este casco.
Comrade Serge, who's here present, he was part of this delegation, and he was gifted by the Miners Union this helmet.
Este casco son los dirigentes de la federación que lo tienen.
This is the helmet that belongs only to the leading members of the federation.
Y con este casco, el camarada Serge puede participar de las reuniones de la dirección de la federación con derecho a voz.
So if he puts his helmet on, Serge has the right to participate in the meetings of the leading body of the federation.
Y ahora estamos trayendo acá este casco para que pueda ser de uno de ustedes.
And this helmet will be yours.
Es una rifa que la haremos, entonces quien quiera puede buscar a cualquier camarada de la delegación brasileña para comprar la
Because
rifa.
it will be raffled during these days. The Brazilian comrades will be selling the raffle tickets.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, first speaker then will be Paras, followed by Jody.
Okay, thank you. Comrades, this is a fantastic beginning of this marvelous conference and extraordinary introduction given by Alan on the manifesto of newly formed RCI. Each and every participant of this historic event, either in this hall or on internet or online, deserve congratulations. I want to intervene on the question of ex-colonial countries. People may ask, what does this international offer to the workers of the ex-colonial, or as they are named, the backward countries? So to understand the solution, it is necessary to understand the fundamental causes of the problem. So the question is, why backward countries are backward? We are Leninists and Trotskyites, and we believe in the theory of permanent revolution. There are so many aspects, but there are two basic reasons of the backwardness of the backward countries. First, incompetency and barbarism of the local ruling classes. Second, loot, plunder, slaughter, exploitation and oppression of not the working classes of the advanced countries, but the ruling classes of the imperialist countries. The pathetic and miserable post-colonial intellectuals of third world see the advanced capitalist countries as a single block and consider them without the differentiation of classes, oppressor as a whole. This is the blunder and ideological bankruptcy of this corrupt intelligentsia. These ideas are also being promoted in the universities of advanced countries just to derail the class consciousness. They labeled Marxism as Eurocentric. On the other hand, some left intellectuals in the West also blame or put responsibility of the backwardness of these backward countries on the working classes of these countries. This is simply ridiculous, in fact criminal, and can be called the contempt of the working class in general. Because the ruling classes and intelligentsia of these backward countries also abuse their own working classes for their backwardness. And at this point, these left intellectuals share the ideas of these rotten people. No communist can ever blame the working class for cultural backwardness. As Marx and Engels explained that who owns the means of production owns the mental production as well. The ruling classes and the so-called intelligentsia of the poor countries, along with their imperialist masters, should be blamed for this backwardness. By the way, question of culture is not so simple, it is very complex. Culture is a superstructure dialectically dependent on its economic foundations. some advanced nations can be culturally more backward than economically backward nations. So this international thing that the interests of Sindhis, Pashtuns, Baloch, Kurds, Arab working classes and the interest of British, French, German and American working classes may apparently and immediately be different, but organically and essentially they are unified. Crisis of capitalism once again highlighted the national question globally, and complexity of national question is increased. Rise of economic nationalism and trade wars expressing the national prejudices of the ruling classes of imperialist nations. On the other hand, Scottish, Irish, Catalans, etc. and the black question in the advanced countries reflects the frustration of middle classes and the fragmented and disoriented layers of working classes. In backward countries, small nations and nationalities are exploited and oppressed brutally and struggling for their basic democratic rights. We support their right of self-determination, but this is not an abstract sport. And this sport is conditioned by the, as a whole, balance of class forces and is subordinated by the interests of global labor movement as the whole. We believe only the working classes of the oppressed nations with the global class solidarity can liberate the oppressed nations. Middle classes or petty bourgeois of these nations has the illusions in the so-called world fraternity and United Nations and the institutions like United Nations. We strongly believe that the institutions like United Nations are the puppets of US and Western imperialism, and in all important global disputes, they played the role of brothels in reality. Gaza war is the latest example. They are the mere spectators of this genocide. Many nationalists like Pashtun and Baloch nationalists in Pakistan usually lose this battle because of this illusion. A few months back, we witnessed the marvelous Baloch uprising in Pakistan that mobilized millions of oppressed Balochs under the leadership of young girls. The fundamental demand of movement was abandonment of enforced disappearances. And now 2 weeks ago, the leadership of that movement visited Norway and US and received so-called resistance awards. Meanwhile, the abduction of Baloch students not only continued, but increased by Pakistani state. So this is a historic law. These petty bourgeois leaderships are destined to betray their rank and file. Their supporters ask us, if not United Nations, that what is the alternate solution? We want to tell them that you can see this conference and this international is the reply to all of them. What does this conference mean? This is on one hand a message to the global working class and true freedom fighters that now the isolated movements and resistance can be gathered, can be collected on one platform to fight for the emancipation of the human race. And at the same time, this conference is ultimatum to the imperialists and the global ruling classes that you are killing our children, your wars, civil wars are destroying the human race. To end these imperialist wars, to end these inhuman wars, civil wars and slaughters, and to wage the only war for which one can die with pride, with smiling face, that is the class war. And in fact, not to wage because that war is going on already, but to win decisively this class war. Communists are coming. Thank you.
One of the main characteristics of the world situation, the enormous instability and turbulence in world relations. We look around the world and we see regional wars, not just in Ukraine and the massacre in Gaza, which are in the highlight, in the spotlight, in the headlines, but many other local and regional wars in which thousands, tens of thousands of people are being killed and they don't even make it into the headlines. One of the main reasons we need to try to understand why this is. I will say that one of the main reasons is the crisis of capitalism. The struggle between different imperialist powers for the loot becomes aggravated when the loot becomes smaller. This is something that Lenin already explained in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. But there is another important factor that we have been explaining for some time, and that is the relative decline of the power of US imperialism. After the fall of Stalinism in the Soviet Union in 1989-91, the world seemed dominated by one major superpower which could face no competition. And that was supposed to be a source of stability. The ruling class were very optimistic. They famously said, "We have won." And they even, in their wild optimism, they went on to talk about the peace dividend. That is, how the money that had been squandered in military spending up until that time will now be used for social spending, housing, healthcare, and education. But that was not to be as could have been predicted. But it is true that at that time, the power of US imperialism was completely unmatched. I am old enough to remember the 1991 Gulf War. And at that time, the US imperialism went to war against Iraq to defend its imperialist interests, but it did so under the banner of the United Nations. At the UN Security Council, Russia voted in favor of the invasion, and China merely abstained. But of course, we all know how the war in Iraq ended up, that one and the following one. And in the intermediate period, there's been a massive change in the balance of forces of the different imperialist powers. The United States in 1960 represented 40% of the world's GDP, and it has now gone down to 24% of the world's GDP. Imperialism is first and foremost an economic relation, and militarism, military spending, foreign military adventures is a consequence of that. And in the meantime, we have seen the rise of new imperialist powers, particularly China, which has gone from 4% of the world's GDP in 1960 to 16%. It is now competing on the world scale for the control of trade routes, markets, spheres of influence, and fields of investment. This has created, this change in the world situation has created enormous confusion, particularly in the so-called communist movement, with wildly different positions, with some arguing that China is still a socialist country of some sort, and that therefore it plays a progressive role in the world scene. But if you ask the working people of Sri Lanka, Congo, or Ecuador, you will get a completely different answer. Be chained by the chains of debt and investment to US imperialism is fundamentally no different than to be chained to Chinese imperialism. There are others who argue that the so-called multipolar world is a progressive development that needs to be defended and promoted. And we decisively reject that foolish idea, because there is no fundamental difference between there being one single imperialist power which exercises its domination almost unhindered, and there being a struggle between different imperialist powers, which then becomes a struggle for markets, and eventually also becomes a struggle that is waged through war. China is clearly not yet in a position to defy the power of the United States from a military point of view anywhere in the world. But China is certainly starting to flex its muscles also on the military scene, particularly around its own borders in the question of Taiwan, the South China Sea, and so on. And this struggle between different imperialist powers has already led to wars, military coups, and regime change in a number of Central African countries, with the direct involvement of Russia, which is also an imperialist power, although not on the same level as China. So therefore, rather than being anything progressive in this, multipolar world, if anything, means more instability, more turbulence, wars, military coups, and struggles for influence, which the working people around the world pay the price of. But we need to be careful with this as well, because it remains the case that the United States is still the most powerful and therefore the most reactionary imperialist power on earth. The decline of the United States as an imperialist power is only relative, and we must stress that. In terms of military spending, the United States is the first country in the world and accounts for 40% of all military spending. And that is more than the combined military spending of the next 10 countries on the list. In any other circumstances, the struggle between a declining imperialist power and new rising imperialist powers will have led to open war already. At the moment, At the moment, this is expressing itself in trade wars, retaliatory tariff barriers, but also in the form of proxy wars, like the war in Ukraine clearly is. And the reason why this has not led to a world war yet, we don't think that this is likely, is the existence of nuclear weapons, which all these different military imperialist powers possess. Capitalists do not wage war for the fun of it, but in order to acquire spheres of influence, markets, and so on. And a war involving nuclear weapons will destroy most of the planet and will leave a situation in which no one will be able to make any profits. But this situation has led, as I said before, to enormous confusion amongst the left. We have seen in the case of Ukraine, for instance, the different communist parties collapsing into absurd positions, some of them supporting their own bourgeois at home, like the Communist Party of the Russian Federation supporting the reactionary imperialist policy of Putin, but also many communist parties in the West supporting Western imperialism and NATO in a more open or covert way, under the so-called argument that this is a struggle for Ukrainian self-determination. Precisely at the time when Ukraine has become a complete colony of the West, where Western imperialist powers pay even the national budget with which they pay the civil servants and all the national expenses. And others still have collapsed into useless petty bourgeois pacifism, both in relation to Ukraine and in relation to Gaza. They say, oh, the United Nations should intervene, should be respect for international law, a position that 100 years ago Lenin completely demolished in his writings about World War I. Perhaps most scandalously, the position of the so-called Fourth International has nothing to do with the Fourth International, with Trotsky or with Trotskyism, which adopted the position of arms for Ukraine and sanctions on Russia, a position of full support for Western imperialism and NATO in this conflict. On this question, we need to go back to the principles. In this discussion, we're not just analyzing the world situation, we are discussing the manifesto on which we are founding the Revolutionary Communist International. And therefore, we not only analyze, but we also explain clearly where we stand and what is our program. Our program is based on two key principles on the question of war. One, the main enemy of the working class is at home. The main enemy of the working class is our own ruling class. Number two, in order to achieve peace, in order to put an end to war, you need to overthrow capitalism and imperialism, which is its highest stage. There's no way that you can achieve war or a ceasefire by appealing to the big powers, to the good-heartedness, and so on. My final point is this. The question of war, and particularly the question of military spending, is now becoming a key political question in all countries, particularly in the NATO countries, which are now engaging in a campaign of increasing military spending, reintroducing or reinforcing national service, conscription, military service, and so on in different countries. And we need to respond to this in a clear way by fighting against militarism, from a socialist point of view, not from a pacifist point of view, and by putting the question in the following terms. They have money for war and for defense spending, but these people are the same people who claim that there is no money for education, for healthcare, for housing, and so on. And this is the basis on which we build our position in relation to imperialist war.
Thanks. After Adam will speak, we'll have Carlos Shea from Mexico.
Hey, comrades, it's Adam from Britain. I don't actually want to speak too much on Britain, though, because there's a session later in the week specifically on Britain. I want to touch on a key feature of British politics that I think demonstrates a wider point that's raised in the manifesto, which has important consequences for our perspectives and for our tasks. Comrades may know that there's an election going on in Britain right now. In Britain, you'd be forgiven if you didn't know this, or more accurately, if you knew about it, but you just didn't care. Because none of the main parties or politicians are offering anything. Labour's programme and slogan can be summed up as Me Too, Tories say austerity, Starmer says Me Too, and so on and so forth. Now, Fiona's campaign is resonating because it's such a breath of fresh air in this otherwise stale, stinking political atmosphere. Because there's such a political vacuum in British politics, such a hatred towards the entire establishment, combined with such an utter criminal silence from the reformists and the left. And I think this is actually one of the defining, most generalized features of the period everywhere. This vast chasm between the objective situation and the subjective factor, between what's necessary, what's demanded, and what's on offer from the so-called left or workers' leaders. You can see how totally inadequate these leaders are on every front. Politically, we've seen the failure of Corbyn and Sanders, Syriza and Podemos, Boric in Chile or Petro in Colombia. Industrially, we've seen strike waves and militant action achieve very few victories in the US, in Britain, because of these leaders. And obviously on the question of Gaza, they have no solution, no strategy beyond vain calls for a ceasefire and repeated marches. And this really emphasizes what we mean when we say that the crisis of capitalism is a crisis of reformism. Alan and others have pointed out that this is the school of reformism that workers will have to go through in experiencing all these limits and betrayals. These events will put every leader, every party, every idea, every tendency to the test. I think it's no exaggeration to say that there is nobody but us who has the ideas, the program, and the methods required. The problem is we're too small. We're not big enough yet to make a decisive impact on events. And so until we are, this political vacuum will continue. We often say in nature, and the same is true in politics, that nature abhors a vacuum. There's this burning hatred towards the traditional parties, but no proper alternative from the left. And so what we're seeing in many countries now are all sorts of weird and wonderful political phenomena and movements that are sprouting up to partially fill this vacuum, acting for a temporary period as a lightning rod for all the anger in society, or giving a distorted expression to the discontent. We've seen that such phenomena can take on all sorts of forms. We've seen the global movements like Black Lives Matter, the climate strikes, the Gaza encampments. We've seen movements of farmers even across Europe in recent months, or the Gilets jaunes in France in recent years. In Britain, in this election, we're likely to see many anti-war, anti-establishment protest votes, people like George Galloway, who won in Rochdale a few months ago. In the past, this same mood coalesced around the national question in Scotland, and even Brexit in some parts. In Spain, we've seen the explosion of the socialist movement in the Basque Country, in Catalonia and elsewhere. In a number of countries, I think we've even seen comedians and celebrities becoming a kind of political reference point. I even think Zelensky was a comedian, if I'm not mistaken. Although I don't think he's laughing now. We've got to recognize that even monstrous figures like Trump reflect this anti-establishment mood in a distorted way. This is important to recognize that consciousness is contradictory. It develops dialectically in swings and leaps, not in a straight line. The worst thing we can do when confronted with a figure like Trump or some of these farmers' movements is to write these layers off as backward and reactionary, just as the liberals do. So these movements and phenomena I've described, they have lots of differences. I think they have two things in common. Firstly, they have a very politically confused and contradictory character without any clear program. Secondly, they are accidental and ephemeral. They're very temporary. They sprout up and then subside within weeks or even days sometimes. And the important conclusion for us from that understanding is that we have to get stuck in straight away in these kind of movements when they sprout up. We have to intervene rapidly and boldly and flexibly to try and recruit the best slayers who are drawn into these movements. Not take some sort of sectarian approach where we sit on the sidelines criticizing these movements for not having the perfect program. All such movements have confused demands. We can't expect anyone to have a fully worked out revolutionary program from the outset. In fact, even our own program is not fully formed and perfectly defined in advance. It's formed and refined through practice, through intervening, through opening up a dialogue with the people in these movements. Let's take the example of the student encampment protests. Boycott and divestment was not our demand. It's not part of our program normally. It was a real living movement with real demands that we had to connect with and try and broaden out and generalize in the way that Jordi's just described. To recognize that any genuine mass struggle will have a contradictory character involving very heterogeneous layers and ideas. As Lenin summarized it, he who wishes to see a pure revolution will never live to see one. Our job is not to sneer and fixate on the negatives when we're confronted with phenomena like these. It's to try and get to the essence of what these represent. Discard the secondary features, separate out the progressive from the reactionary and accentuate the positives, and then skillfully link these to the general needs, the general demands that are required by history. This is the transitional method, the transitional demands, the transitional program. linking the particular demands of the movement to the general needs. And we can summarize it by saying that what we really need to do is learn to listen and learn to think. This is what Lenin would do if he was confronted by any of these phenomena today. And I think if we can do this, patiently explain, we can become that lightning rod. We will become that catalyst, that reference point for radicalized workers and youth. Only with a very important difference from all the other phenomena and movements that I've just described. We will be able to offer those workers and youth a Bolshevik cadre organization to join. An organization that can turn this anger into a material force capable of transforming society.
Carlos Shea, where are you? Oh, there you are. After Carlos, we'll have Alex from Germany.
Hemos explicado que la crisis del capitalismo también se expresa como una crisis del reformismo.
We've said that the crisis of capitalism is also a crisis of reformism.
Creo que América Latina en los últimos años da ejemplos muy concretos de ello.
Latin America is full of examples of this from the last period.
Incluso uno de los procesos más avanzados, como puede ser Venezuela, que ha llegado a una catástrofe.
Even the country that went the furthest, that is Venezuela, ended up in catastrophe.
Señaló que era necesario ir al socialismo. La revolución se
Chávez said that the revolution should lead to socialism, but the revolution was not completed.
Lo único que ha ocurrido es que se ha alterado el propio funcionamiento del capitalismo y hoy tenemos.
And what happened in the end is that capitalism was only meddled with slightly, and this has led to disaster. Millions of Venezuelans, especially young people, are fleeing from the country. And the rise of Milei in Argentina is closely connected to the failure of Kirchnerism in that country. We see that the old order is in crisis, all the old parties are falling apart. But the new political forces, those different reformist movements that have emerged, are incapable of solving the problems.
Este ascenso de la ultraderecha, como en el caso Milei en Argentina o antes lo que vimos con Bolsonaro en Brasil, son movimientos firmes, sino
But the rise of these new far-right forces like Milei in Argentina or Bolsonaro previously in Brazil are very unstable movements.
Digo, la clase obrera argentina está pagando con sus huesos vida catástrofe, ¿no? Pero también está luchando, la clase obrera ha dado algunas acciones, también las comunidades, los pueblos se están rebelando.
The working class in Argentina is footing the bill for this catastrophe, but even there we see that entire communities and the working class are fighting back.
En el caso donde podemos ver a la derecha o a la ultraderecha con cierta base social como es en El Salvador, esta solidez no se ve.
And even in countries where the right wing seems to have a more solid basis, like in El Salvador, in the long term, this will prove not to be so.
Bukele ha logrado momentáneamente acabar con el problema de la violencia y eso le da una base de masas.
Bukele has been able temporarily to put an end to violence, and that has garnered him mass support.
Las masas están sufriendo la parte económica. Tienen ilusiones en que la situación va a cambiar. Bukele dice que va a haber un mundo milagro, va a cambiar en el.
But the masses have all sorts of expectations about the economy that Bukele is fostering.
Evidentemente que esto no va.
But obviously those expectations will not materialize.
Pero vemos otros procesos del reformismo donde todavía tiene una base de apoyo, como es el caso de Colombia o México.
In other countries, reformism has a base of support, as in Colombia or in Honduras and in Mexico.
Lo que vemos con los reformistas es que tienen una enorme desconfianza en las masas, apoyan y fortalecen al Estado burgués para poder gobernar.
What we see is that the reformists do not trust the masses, so they lean on the state apparatus and they strengthen it so as to be able to govern.
Utilizan a las masas como un medio de presión para hacer avanzar al lado.
They only mobilize the masses in order to put pressure on the state or to scare the right wing.
bueno, de México.
If you look at the figures coming from Mexico, you might think that this is a historical exception.
El domingo pasado hubo reformistas, el movimiento obradorista, no de manera apoyadora.
Last Sunday there were elections and the left, the Obradorista movement won a crushing victory.
Obrador va a terminar con una enorme autoridad. Se reflejó en los
López Obrador ended his term with enjoying enormous authority, and that was reflected in the ballot box. His candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum, won with 59% of the vote.
3 millones de votos.
That is 33 million votes.
López Obrador hace 6 años ganó con el apoyo y 3 millones.
López Obrador 6 years ago won with 52% of the vote, equal to 30 million votes. That means that his support has not fallen, but has increased, in fact.
Candidata de la derecha, la verdad es que da vergüenza, capaz de
The right-wing candidate was ridiculous and completely useless, and lost a lot of votes because of that.
Pero es la candidata que merecía la derecha.
But this candidate was a faithful representative of the class that she represents.
Ella obtuvo
He got 27% of the vote.
tercera fuerza que capta jóvenes.
And the third party that is connected to the youth got 10% of the votes.
Se debe a
And this owes to different factors.
lado hay un gente conoce lo que son los partidos de la burguesía, quiere ser
People know what the parties of the ruling class are like, and they don't want to go back to the past.
de familias reciben apoyos de parte de
Millions of families are getting benefits from the López Obrador government.
Obrador diariamente tiene una conferencia directa.
López Obrador also cultivates an immediate connection with his followers through his daily
La
conferences.
situación económica parece no hay gran inflación.
Economic situation seems to be stable. There is no inflation is not high, and the peso is strong.
Lo que está ocurriendo es son mucho más fuertes.
If we scratch beneath the surface, we will see that what is really happening is that the economy is becoming completely interlinked and subordinated to the United States.
Económico, las nuevas se están ligadas a las partes de Estado.
Economic growth and the new industries that are developing are connected to U.S. industry.
Sigue siendo uno de los países los pionarios haciendo
Mexico remains one of the most unequal societies in the world, where the multimillionaires are becoming even richer.
problemas que muestran de también.
There are other additional problems that show the bankruptcy of reformism, such as the question of violence.
El gobierno de López Obrador ha habido más asesinatos.
During López Obrador's term in office, the murder rate went up, actually.
Es de 150, más de 100 desaparecidos.
There were 155,000 recorded murders, and 110,000 disappeared people.
Una enorme descomposición que también se cree del crimen organizado.
There's a situation of social decomposition that is reflected in the rise of organized crime.
Las masas tienen una ilusión gradualista. Todo se avanzamos un poco y seguiremos avanzando.
Masses are patient and have the illusion that we are making gradual improvements, and that in the next 6 years we will keep making progress.
La realidad es
But the truth is that nothing fundamental is being settled, no fundamental problem.
que reformista termina arropándose o mostrando a la burguesía que no van a hacerles daño.
And as the manifesto says, in their cowardice, the reformists always try to prove to the ruling class that they are trustworthy managers of the system.
Lo que está haciendo Claudia Sheinbaum, la candidata ganadora, dando un montón de señales de que lejos de estar conforme, no tienen que tener miedo.
This is exactly what Claudia Sheinbaum is doing now, sending all sorts of signals to the ruling class that she's trustworthy, that she's predictable, that they should not be scared.
Hay por ejemplo, los maestros estado luchando diciendo López Obrador no echó abajo la reforma contra la educación.
But there are cracks opening up. For instance, the teachers have been protesting because López Obrador did not do away with the Peña Nieto education counter-reform.
Uno de los puntos que planteó López Obrador, parecer qué pasó con los 43 estudiantes que Sinapa Guerrero.
One of the old promises of López Obrador is that he would do justice to the families of the 43 students that disappeared in the town of Ayotzinapa in 2014.
El proceso avanzó hasta que tuvieron que tocar a los militares.
He did start an investigation, but that ended as soon as the question of the military came up.
López Obrador ha estado apoyando y sido a las Fuerzas Armadas a llevar adelante
Because López Obrador has been leaning on the armed forces in order to push through his program.
el términos reales, aunque tenga demagogia y haya esclarado algunas detalles, realmente es una traición.
And although he has, and although some steps have been taken, in truth, this is a betrayal to those that went missing in Ayotzinapa.
De los sectores que me votó por Claudia Sheinbaum fueron los jóvenes.
And Claudia Sheinbaum did not get such strong support amongst the youth.
Nosotros tenemos que entender el movimiento en general, también orientarnos a las más
To have an orientation to the general movement, but especially we have to connect with the most advanced layers that are drawing revolutionary conclusions.
Por eso tenemos que ser muy reformistas y alternativa comunista.
We have to be very critical with the reformists and put forward a revolutionary communist alternative to the youth.
Tenemos que construir un partido revolucionario, una internacional revolucionaria, de manera independiente, atrayendo a esos.
We are launching a new revolutionary communist international that is independent and that can attract this youth.
No es ninguna excepción, el reformismo va a fracasar, solo que tiene condiciones particulares y un ritmo diferente, pero el camino ya lo hemos visto en otros.
Mexico is not on a different planet, it just has a slightly different rhythm and the conditions are slightly different, but the fundamental processes are the same.
So Alex will be next, followed by Arturo.
So comrades, you know that Germany now has a Veterans Day. It will be celebrated this weekend. Now it will be fine to sing good old soldiers' song in public again, or at least once a year. Yeah. Militarism is moving to the center of politics in Germany. Ruling class is trying to create national unity with patriotism, with fear of war and repression. Times of stability are finally over in Germany. Crises of recent years have shaken society to the core, and polarization is growing by the day. Parliament is extremely fragmented, and all established parties are in crisis, as the EU elections show. If general elections were held today, the right-wing AfD would be in second place with 16% or more of the vote. Self-declared progressive government of Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals would be hugely punished for its policies because they are involved in the Ukraine war, pushing the economic crisis on the working class, and they broke all their promises within a few weeks after the last elections. Conservative Party, which benefits solely from its opposition or position in the opposition, and they would have to go into government with one or two of these discredited parties again. This means from now on, there will be only one crisis government after the other in Germany. Two state elections in eastern Germany, this September, the AfD might win over 30% of the vote. This might lead to crisis of government there without any precedent in the last decades. Establishment parties have no solid social base anymore, because their policies don't only attack the working class, but to a growing extent also the middle classes. And the government has to go on the offensive and implement austerity measures. But they know that this could easily lead to a social explosion, and this results in permanent public clashes between the governing parties. The government cannot solve any of the problems that German capitalism is facing now.